In this CloudFormation template, myLambda authorizer function defines an AWS Lambda function named myLambda authorizer function. It specifies the function's code stored in an S3 bucket, its handler, execution role, runtime, and timeout settings. MyAPI Gateway Authorizer defines an API gateway authorizer named myLambda authorizer. It specifies the authorizer type, token, the authorizer URI pointing to the Lambda function, the identity source, authorization header, the API gateway ID, and the result cache duration. For CRUD operations on the stack, create the CloudFormation stack. Bash. Copy code. AWS CloudFormation create stack. Stack name myLambda authorizer stack. Template body file : /lambda authorizer template YAML. Read details of the stack. Bash. Copy code. AWS CloudFormation describe stacks. Stack name myLambda authorizer stack. Update the CloudFormation stack. Bash. Copy code. AWS CloudFormation update stack. Stack name myLambda authorizer stack. Template body file : /updated lambda authorizer template YAML. Delete the CloudFormation stack. Bash. Copy code. AWS CloudFormation delete stack. Stack name myLambda authorizer stack. An analogy for this setup could be compared to a security checkpoint at the entrance of a building. The Lambda authorizer acts as the security guard who checks the authorization token, like an access badge, provided by the client, requesting user. If the token is valid, the guard grants access to the building, API gateway resources; otherwise, access is denied. This script is a CloudFormation template written in YAML format. It defines several AWS resources, including a Lambda function, a private API gateway, an API gateway resource, and a method. Let's break down each part of the script. AWS template format version, September 9, 2010, specifies the version of the AWS CloudFormation template format being used. Resources. This section defines the AWS resources that will be created or managed by the CloudFormation template. MyEdge Lambda function defines an AWS Lambda function named myEdge Lambda function. Type: AWS Lambda function specifies the type of resource as a Lambda function. Properties defines the configuration properties for the Lambda function. Code specifies the location of the Lambda function code in an S3 bucket, myLambda functions bucket, and the file myLambda function zip. Handler specifies the entry point of the Lambda function code, index.handler. Role specifies the execution role ARN for the Lambda function. Runtime specifies the runtime environment for the Lambda function, Node.js 14x. Timeout specifies the timeout duration for the Lambda function execution, 10 seconds. The myPrivate API Gateway defines a private API gateway named myPrivate API Gateway. Type: AWS API Gateway. REST API specifies the type of resource as a REST API. Properties defines the configuration properties for the API gateway. Name specifies the name of the API gateway as myPrivate API. Description provides a description for the API gateway. Endpoint configuration specifies the endpoint types for the API gateway, private. Tags specifies tags to associate with the API gateway. MyAPI Gateway Resource defines a resource within the API gateway. Type: AWS API Gateway Resource specifies the type of resource as an API gateway resource. Properties defines the configuration properties for the API gateway resource. Parent ID specifies the parent resource ID of the API gateway resource. Path part specifies the path part of the API gateway resource. MyAPI Gateway Method defines a method for the API gateway resource. Type: AWS API Gateway Method specifies the type of resource as an API gateway method. Properties defines the configuration properties for the API gateway method. HTTP method specifies the HTTP method for the API gateway method, GET. Authorization type specifies the authorization type for the API gateway method, none. Resource ID specifies the resource ID of the API gateway resource. REST API ID specifies the ID of the API gateway. Integration specifies the integration settings for the API gateway method, including the type, AWS_proxy, and URI, points to the lambda function. Overall, this CloudFormation script sets up an architecture where an API gateway method, HTTP GET, is integrated with a lambda function, and both are encapsulated within a private API gateway.